Good afternoon. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Demand and Distributed Energy Market Integration Working Group Session 2 to review some key issues and facilitate discussion to formulate problem statement. My name is Yelena Kopolov-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm joined by Ansel Lundberg, Senior Policy Developer, Jill Powers, Demand Response and Distributed Energy Sector Manager, and Jimmy Bashara and Juan Buitrago, both account managers. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, these materials are available on the Demand and Distributed Energy Market Integration Working Group Initiative page, and you can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, navigating to the Stakeholder Center tab at the top, selecting policy initiatives, and that'll take you to the main landing page for all the initiatives. Then you could do a search or scroll down and find this working group, and the latest documents will be at the top, including this presentation. A few housekeeping reminders before we get started, that this call is being recorded for informational convenience purposes, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And these collaborative working groups are intended to stimulate an open dialogue and engage different perspectives. So please keep your comments professional and respectful. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send the chat to the event producer. Today's event producer is Ahmed. To raise your hand, make sure you open the participant and chat panels from the bottom right corner of WebEx, and the raise hand icon is nestled at the bottom of the participant panel. If you dialed in outside of the WebEx, you can press *3 to get into the question queue. And please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question. You can send your chat to all panelists from the chat box on the bottom right. And if you need technical assistance, Ahmed is there for you. So we have a agenda for today, but this is just, we're going to be reviewing the key issues of current DR performance and PEM methodologies. We're going to be going over standards. We're going to be going over how we got here with the history of FERC filings there, and then we've got the MGO versus and there will be time after each just a discussion to be going over and getting your feedback and having the discussion there for our problem statement formation to go forward with this. And from here, I'm going to hand it over to Ansel.
All right. Thank you, Yelena.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. So just where we are, I forgot this slide got added into here. We are here before the proposal development and what we call pre-proposal development, where we're going through and working on problem statements so that we can eventually get to an issue paper. So we are in session 2 of our working group. Okay, now off to you, Ansel. Thank you.
Yeah. So real quick, Ansel's got a lot of really good content for us, kind of queued up for each one of those key areas, but just want to highlight the working group progress to date, kind of keep in mind, where we are, where we're going, where we've been. So we've identified and confirmed those principles. We're confirming the problem statements that's here. That's kind of session 1 and 2 for PEM. We'll tackle each of those other themes, and that drives us towards being able to get out of the scoping and problem statement definition and into the proposal development, which you'll see there as a third bullet. And that's really going to be based off of the progress that we have in the discussions and confirming all of these problem statements. So looking forward to the discussion a little bit later today. We're going to be able to have the community kind of react to the ISO putting forth what we think we've heard, right? So a draft problem statement, we're seeking confirmation from you, and then a couple of areas that just need a little bit of further discussion. So let's go ahead and just move on to the next slide real quick. So what are the goals for today's meeting? We are going to continue that overview of performance evaluation methodologies. So during our last working group, we gave a high-level overview on telemetry, metering, and the PEMs for DR. So today we intend to, with Ansel's help, go through and clarify some of those key elements in those same topic areas, and then we can confirm the stakeholder feedback we've heard and really lean into those stakeholder discussions for problem statement formulation. So we hope to leverage a discussion on each one of those key areas that we'll be reviewing to draft a problem statement and scope issues moving forward here. We're also going to have a stakeholder presentation from CEDMEX, so we appreciate the offer and the content there. Again, open. It is an open invite. If you are interested in presenting in any of the themes, please do let us know. Several of you already have via the comments to our discussion paper and with reaching out, so we appreciate that. It really leads to, I think, an engaged discussion when you guys are part of that conversation. So with that, Ansel, I don't want to delay any further. I'll go ahead and hand the floor to you for the material you have prepared for us.
Yeah, thanks, Juan. Looking forward to kind of having this back and forth between some of the information that I'll be sharing today with discussion led by yourself and Jimmy and guided by our stakeholders. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we met last on March 3rd, and I gave kind of a high-level overview of the performance evaluation methodologies for demand response that the California ISO currently has in our tariff and business practice manuals. And so that was, we had a good discussion there, again, kind of at a higher level, reviewing the models and methodologies that we have available to our participants to represent demand response performance. So I think today we just want to spend some time diving into a few issues and areas of what we covered on March 3rd based on the comments we received and based on the discussion we had on the 3rd with you all, the stakeholders, as well as some of the stakeholder presentations that we heard on that day. So some of this is going to be a review of what we covered a month ago, and then I'll be trying to kind of highlight some key areas and go in more depth in certain areas as well. Next slide, please. So as we discussed last meeting, this is what you saw as far as how I characterize the ISO's demand response market participation models. So this includes two sort of major models, the proxy demand resource model and the reliability demand response resource participation model. And so everything we discussed on that day is relevant, but I just want to step back a little bit from this slide that is relevant to the performance evaluation methodologies. That is, the PEMs are how aggregations that participate under these models are evaluated for their performance. I will also note at the bottom of that slide, there's a link to our demand response or our sort of load participation matrix, which has a lot more information about existing structures and rules around these models. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already. We refer to that regularly and try to keep it updated. So next slide. So PDR and RDRR are what we were discussing on the 3rd of March, but I didn't want to leave out these other models that may be familiar to this group. So the third line that I added there is HDERA, also known as our Heterogeneous Distributed Energy Resource Aggregation Model. That may be familiar to folks as our FERC Order 2222 compliant DER participation model. And so I've got some details there as far as how that resources in that model can participate in our markets. And on the right column, I noted that, so you may be asking, okay, do the performance evaluation methodologies that we reviewed last meeting, do those get used to determine performance for that model? And the answer is yes, to some extent. So if you read into the HDERA materials and documentation, you'll notice that there is a way to incorporate an aggregated demand response resource or set of resources into an HDERA resource itself as part of that bigger aggregation. And that is referred to as a distributed curtailment resource. So that is, the performance of that kind of aggregation is evaluated using the PEMS and the baseline methodologies that we reviewed. And then on the last line, which is, it's grayed out because it does, actually, let's go to the next slide. So the last line you'll see is grayed out, and it's also not included in this orange circle. So it's gray because it's not what we would consider a supply-side demand response participation model. So this may be, some of the verbiage here may be familiar to our WEIM participants, and this is a description of how non-CAISO BA WEIM participants incorporate their demand response resources into the Western energy imbalance market. And again, this is not a supply-side participation model per se, but it is detailed in our WEIM business practice manual as far as how DR programs can be incorporated into the short-term load forecast in a way that allows entities to incorporate those resources into passing their resource efficiency evaluation. So that's not, in the right column on that line, you'll see we indicate it does not, this model or this sort of accounting model does not rely on the baseline methodologies to determine performance in the WEIM. And I said directly there because it may be the case that WEIM participants, and the demand response programs that are incorporated through this process may be evaluated, their performance may be evaluated using, some kind of baseline model, and probably based on some of the same principles that we use to develop our baseline methodologies, either coming out of the NASB business practice manuals, which is kind of an industry standard, and we'll touch more on that later. So, but we won't be talking about that last line in this conversation because, again, CAISO does not use our performance evaluation methodologies to evaluate the performance of those demand response programs. But the orange box circles the resource models that do use what we discussed on the third for baseline determination. Let's go to the next slide. So let's hand it to Jimmy and Juan to kind of touch on the problem statement that comes out of this area of discussion, and then we can move forward whenever we're ready.
Thanks, Ansel. All right, yeah, so thanks, folks. Pleasure to be here. We did make some sort of late tweaks, minor tweaks to the deck today, so in case you don't have the latest version pulled up, it should be online. Otherwise, we'll make sure to repost after the meeting. But if you we want to move to the next slide, maybe. So we're getting into this category of the performance evaluation methodology, right? I think Ansel did a nice job of level setting the current paradigms out there. So here we are now, sort of digging into really what are the actual problems we want to really focus on and potentially move to the proposal development stage, right? So we tried to really capture what we heard to date from all the comments. I think we had 2 rounds of written comments and a couple working groups, right, to collate all of this input. So if we miss anyone, please let us know. Any other thoughts, obviously, please let us know. But as you can see, really, we thought it would be best to start off with what we heard from DMM, just kind of noting that the full suite of the current offered methodologies are just generally underutilized. Noticing, right, we have a lot of participation typically within the day matching combined methodology, which we can get into here more in detail. So that sort of, DMM, sort of thought that raises concerns on the overall efficiency and accuracy in these performance methodologies. So really, we're wanting to focus on that. Do folks agree with DMM's assessment? If not, we can sort of dig into what other baselines might be needed. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And before moving to the next one and turning it over to Juan, any comments, questions on this so far? what Ansel covered, what Elena opened up with, the goal of today's working group, and then with this initial sort of starting point for the problem statement. And did we capture it correctly? Any other thoughts? Did we miss anybody? Let us know.
Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, and again, if I could maybe just add to what Jimmy outlined there, what we have here is really our proposed problem statement. So we're looking for your reaction. Should the eventual policy development that is really the fruit of this working group be something that addresses the underutilization of our current offered methodologies? We do seem to have a lot of mass, right? Critical mass coming in. 99% of baselines being used are the day matching combined. So does anyone have any reactions? Agree, disagree? Do you believe that there, what might be some of the reasons that we have such a heavy centralization into day matching combined? So I see. So yeah, Jimmy, I'll read this off to the chat for you, but we did get a comment here that Sunrun does share the same view that the existing PEMs are not well suited for behind the meter batteries.
Yeah, I saw that too. Thanks, Juan. Yeah, we'll note that. I appreciate that comment from Sunrun. Great. Yeah, that's what we want to hear. Sounds like that's an accurate depiction and portrayal of what Sunrun wanted to convey as well. So we made a note of that. Any other questions? I can't see the queue.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, let's go to the question from Kate. I've got a hand from Kate Unger.
Hi all. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure we're addressing all of the bullets on the page, or did you just want to talk about the first one first?
Preferably the first one, but yeah. Any other comments if you want to go skip to the second one? But
I'll skip just because it follows up on the comment from Sunrun. I just recognize and agree with this that regarding behind the meter batteries and the existing methodologies not working well. I have had a chance to look at the rest of the deck, but haven't gone through it rigorously. I am not clear on whether there is a draft problem statement that addresses the other big issue for behind the meter batteries, which is the not counting exports. So if it's not captured elsewhere, then it should be captured here, but I suspect it actually would make more sense elsewhere. Just wanted to mention it here because I think this is the problem statement that is most closely relevant that I've noticed so far.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So I think we're internally deciding how to address the exports issue following this category. And if it doesn't fit neatly into another category, we'll definitely make sure to tie the linkage to this category. But duly noted, we received your comments on that. And I think what we decided was really to focus on the baselines for load, right? Traditionally, how DR is accounted for load. And so I think that was how we tried to splice it. But definitely, yeah, duly noted, your comments weren't lost on the exports. And we think it would be better tied in for a future conversation, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And that's why I was referencing that I might not have seen it elsewhere in the deck. And didn't necessarily expect it to be here, just wanted to make sure that it gets in somewhere.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. This is Ansel. I'll just jump in briefly. I think this is probably the most relevant draft problem statement for that matter, related to performance evaluation methodologies directly. We do have some more. I'll be covering a little bit more on the metering generator output methodology later on, and so we could also talk about it in that context. But we'll note your comment there for sure. So thank you.
Okay, and we have a comment in the chat from Tom Flynn that says this problem statement is consistent with what we've heard from stakeholders in our SB 846 load flex process. And then we also have a hand from Colin Smith.
sorry, real quick, Yelena, and I think to Kate's question, right? Perhaps having all the problem statements together maybe created some confusion. Tom, I'm assuming you're talking about the current methodologies being underutilized. We do want to kind of have that as a discussion, and then going into that second draft problem statement of the 5 and 10 and 10 and 10. So thank you. Yeah, Jimmy, I'll let you keep going. You got other comments.
Yeah, and great to hear from you, Tom. Other questions, other comments, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, there's a couple more comments in the chat. Helen Lowe from SMUD says, investigate and explore if performance evaluation methodologies and settlement should be different for EIM/EDAM entities from participants internal to CAISO BA, such as PG&E, CCA, and third-party aggregators, given the delta in context. If so, why it makes sense for EIM/EDAM entities to take a different approach, and how the approach will be better for the entities, the EIM/EDAM markets, and CAISO as the EIM/EDAM market operator.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks, Yelena. Good question. So I think that's sort of getting more to the solution space, I think, and what approach would be more appropriate. Definitely good delineation, right? WEIM versus EDAM versus the internal BA participants. So I think once we can coalesce around what is actually needed, then we can sort of get into that sort of discussion. But really, given the working group structure and identifying the problem statement, we just want to be sure to align what the actual issue is first. If folks tend to agree that the current suite of baselines is just underutilized, and we can make more, we can take advantage more of what's out there currently, then we're all ears. Otherwise, moving into, okay, what's actually being used now, as you can see in the second bullet, and whether we want to tweak anything that's currently out there. So, but definitely that's a great note moving forward. So thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy. There's a couple more comments here. Jahan from PG&E says, control group methodologies offer a solution to capturing behind-the-meter battery exports. However, there are issues with the implementation and data availability.
Thanks for that. That's a great to know. I'm capturing that right now.
Okay. And then from Yang Yu, does the problem statement solely focus on PEM issues? Through our previous comments, we also wanted to address a device-level registration as part of the enrollment issues.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. We're actually, if you want to save that thought for here in the later rounds of the presentation, we are getting to sort of that device-level measurement issue and how that relates to all of this. But really focusing on just the initial sort of threshold question, right? Are these underutilized? Do we need more? Kind of thing. So, but that's a good question. Yeah, stay tuned for that later here shortly.
And I think that's everything in the chat. And then we have Nadia Kranz from PacifiCorp says PacifiCorp agrees with both problem statements listed on the slide. And then we do have a hand from Colin Smith.
Thanks, Pac. Go ahead, Colin. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. On the first problem statement, reading it, one concern I have is that it reads a little bit like the problem is that there's too many baseline methodologies, and that this leads to efficiency and accuracy concerns. And that could lead to the conclusion that the solution is to reduce the number of baseline methodologies because there's just too many of them. But I think that misses an important nuance, which the second problem statement kind of gets at, which is that the reason a lot of the methodologies are underutilized is not because they're not effective or efficient methodologies, but because there's some sort of regulatory or operational barrier that's really preventing DER aggregators from using them at the scale that they would like to. I think you kind of have one example here in this sub-bullet about control group baselines and how they require access to non-participant data and how that's an operational barrier that's preventing them from being utilized. We'll hear some more barriers for baselines, actually, like the MGO, like you said later in the working group. But I just think it makes sense that if we are as we are framing the problem statements, we should make it more clear that the solution is not necessarily that we kind of reduce the problem statements to the point where or reduce the baseline options to the point where the only one that is available is the one that's being used most often, but actively looking at why certain methodologies are not being used and what we can do to make them better, more suitable for use by DER guide readers today.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I think you hit the nail right in the head with the latter point, right? That we're looking to see why the methods aren't being used and what barriers there are. But I think your first point about how this initial problem statement gets to reducing the number of methods, that's a good point that I don't think we really thought that would be the takeaway, but I can see how you're thinking that was the takeaway. So that's a good thought that we're logging down. But yeah, I think the focus is on your latter point that, okay, if they are being underutilized, what can we do in the existing baselines to reduce those sort of barriers?
I'd be curious to hear from this community if there are, to maybe pull on that thread a little bit more of what they see as the barriers. Colin, you mentioned kind of sub-bulleted and I think it's okay if we kind of combine these problem statement conversations, right? But I would be curious to hear more about those barriers that are seen in the methodologies outside of the day matching combined, right? When you have 99% using day matching combined, right? There has to be something that is either kind of an ease of use from that regulatory or operational perspective. What other barriers might be leading such a heavy centralization? I don't know if anybody's willing to share their thoughts on that. We'd appreciate it.
Yeah, this is exactly where I think we want to go with this discussion. Any other questions, maybe to leap off of Colin's comment or anything else?
There's no other hands currently. There were a couple comments from John Kitchen in the chat saying PG&E agrees. I'm not sure which part this is for. As per our comments, when we attempted to make a PDR resource, the accepted baseline methodologies came in around 30% less than our methodologies that meet OPUC requirements. The current baseline requirement is point of concern for PG&E. Additionally, to the point of a multitude of methodologies, there are a lot of different customer bases that CAISO covers. The customer behaviors in the Pacific Northwest are going to be different than in California. Our profiles are going to be different due to our different climate, our programs are different, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Yolanda. Thanks for the question. That's a great point. So, before jumping to even the approaches or different potential ways to accommodate solutions for the different, WEIM versus EDM versus internal folks and entities, yeah, so to the extent we want to highlight the differences in how the initial problem is, right, and what different issues each of those entities may be facing, that would be good to note.
Yeah, it looks like John had jumped off for a few minutes, but yeah, this is an area we'd like to explore a bit more in terms of, he's kind of laid out the problem statement of a methodology that's being used and has been approved through the OPUC, them doing the comparison analysis against the currently available in-market participation methodologies. Would love to have John maybe help us understand a little bit more about the OPUC process and how they're doing their evaluations of these type of baselines. Do they follow certain standardizations? Is it something that we could shared information on that. Definitely would like to explore this a little bit more with John. He may not be on the call now because it looked like he jumped off, but did want to kind of make mention of that. And I will say, I guess, to give some history on the methodologies, and to his point about, differences, different type of customer bases, really different load profiles that they might experience outside of our California BAA, which is the area that we mainly focused on with the current methodology. So definitely we'll take that into consideration as we're looking at our problem statements, because that potentially is a problem statement that needs to be fleshed out a bit more under the performance evaluation methodology discussion points. So thank you for that, John.
Thank you. And I just checked, and John is gone, so he'll be back in a little bit, but he's not in the attendee list now. And we do have another comment in the chat from Colin Smith. I think the second problem statement and sub-bullet gets to some of the challenges with using control group and 5 and 10 methodologies, respectively. I saw the CED and C's presentation. We'll get into some of the challenges with MGO and EVSE baselines as well.
Appreciate that, Colin. And, you mentioned in your comments that one of those barriers is the need for access to non-participant data. And I'm going to take this opportunity to kind of jump into the second problem statement, right? Existing PEMs, such as the commonly used 5 and 10 and 10 and 10, are not well suited for emerging DERs like behind-the-meter batteries and EVs. There's frequent dispatching distorts baseline calculations. So the frequent, perhaps if you wouldn't mind jumping on and let's talk a little bit about that frequent dispatching, because I think it depends on how high a level of frequency, right? To make sure that we're actually being able to measure that incrementality of a response. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you on this one. I appreciate the comment in the chat here, but I'm curious if somebody who, we had LEAP, PAC, the DR parties, PG&E, Tesla, Voltus, help us understand a little bit how you see that balance between that threshold of frequent dispatch when it distorts baseline calculations and when it's actually a part of being able to hold a comparison, actually get to the baseline so we can measure that incrementality. Any thoughts from the community on that? Or any thoughts from our subject matter experts in the room, Jill or Ansel?
Okay, let's unmute. Colin? Colin, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I can speak to that a little bit. Incrementality is critical for measuring demand response to know that there, is a response to an event that the customer is doing, something different than maybe they would have. And I think that the way that, X and 10 baselines tend to think about that is, an incremental response is a response that's different than what the customer normally does. And so, they look at what the customer did in previous days to understand how they're acting differently in response to a demand response event. And that's how you kind of measure incrementality. You're comparing the customer to itself. But I think in the new, world of demand response that's, being created with resources that can dispatch potentially every day, like batteries or EVs, for example, it makes more sense to think of demand response incrementality as, a demand response or performance is a deviation from what the customer would have done in the absence of a demand response signal. And I think that control group baselines really do a good job illustrating this difference, right? Like if you have a group of non-participating customers to compare a demand response customer against, then you're not comparing that customer to what they normally do. You're comparing that customer to a counterfactual that demonstrates what they would have done if there was no demand response events. And the way you're getting that counterfactual is by comparing them to a group of non-participating customers. Similarly, the prescriptive baseline approach that I described in my presentation, the last working group, takes a similar approach, right? You're demonstrating that incrementality because you're comparing the customer to a analysis of the average load for those types of customers under those types of conditions based on historic data on customers across the state or the market region or what have you. But I think the point is that, like, if you have a situation in which you can demonstrate incrementality without having to reference what the customer did, without having to define incrementality as something different than what the customer had done in the days before, then that opens up a more ability to utilize these resources as frequently as they're actually able to be used. Like a battery could be dispatched every single day with no customer fatigue. And that's not possible under baselines like X and 10 baselines, but is possible under something like a control group or prescriptive baseline approach.
Colin, I appreciate you raising your hand, jumping back in there. I'm curious, Jill, Ansel, any reactions or thoughts to that?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. We will get a little more into this topic later on. I think that difference between kind of incremental versus a control group, developing a baseline of usual behavior, if you will, and then how do you reconcile that with kind of frequent ISO dispatch. I think I would like to hear more about kind of the specific problem there, because, some of the methodologies we have account for that to some extent, but I understand kind of what you're getting at as far as what you shared at your presentation in the March meeting. So anything else, Jill?
Yeah, no, just some of the things that jump out at me as you were making your comments. Is this really a baseline issue under like the non-event day matching versus a sub-metering with respect to MGO? I think we'll get into more discussion on MGO, where we did kind of consider frequent dispatch. But now, thank you for the additional information. I'm starting to understand. It's more of the definition of incrementality that you're focusing on. At first I thought maybe this was more on the sub-metering issue, but you are redefining what the thought is of incrementality versus how we've described it in the past through other initiatives as well as other regulatory forums for behind the meter or meter generator output of behind the meter assets. So maybe we can have more discussion in it as we are attempting in today's discussion to help clarify how the MGO methodology kind of moved away from the issues related to the day matching. But it does require sub-metering, so that's why I was getting into the problem statement, baseline versus sub-metering. And we will, clarify, how the perspective of incrementality is viewed by the ISO in terms of an incremental response of a load curtailment to an ISO dispatch. And again, as a market supply side resource.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Colin, and thank you everybody for kind of reacting here. It really does help us kind of understand, to the points that Jill made that we'll be tackling a little bit later. I'm hearing a need to identify any potential barriers, right, that may be leading towards this centralization of day matching combined. And then once those barriers are identified, an assessment, if it is something that, if it's operational or regulatory, where could we potentially effectuate any change, and with that move into an exploration of whether or not there are new baselines that are needed. So to the community, can I get a kind of a confirmation of, let's call it we came into it with a draft problem statement for us to tweak and take your feedback on, but am I capturing what the community is wanting this working group to explore as it relates to these two? Does anyone disagree with that assessment?
A new hand went up from Sabrina, and we had an existing hand earlier before this question. So we can go to,
oh,
do you want to go to Sabrina now? Yeah.
No, let's go to the existing hand. I apologize. I missed that.
We'll go to Kate Unger, and then we'll go to Sabrina.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was mute or unmute. I had my hand up because as Colin was talking, I was going to point out the prescriptive baseline, and then he started talking about it. So I'm partly going to say +1 on what Colin was saying, that I think it's very useful to look at different kinds of measurement frameworks rather than the day matching for these kinds of resources. And just to clarify, we're talking about resources that, like behind the meter batteries, which is what I focus on more, that will dispatch for reasons that have nothing to do with CAISO market participation, but will dispatch for customer bill savings and other purposes on other days. We don't want to discourage those kinds of responses when they help the grid. And we want to be able to have a conception of incrementality and a way of measuring it that doesn't penalize resources doing what they can to help the grid on non-event days that have nothing to do with the CAISO needs, but address other needs, but still that do respond on event days. And how do we capture the incrementality on event days against what those resources might have done absent the event? And I think we definitely want to look into these control group baselines. Prescriptive baseline from demand side grid support. We have thoughts about pros and cons and are looking forward to having the conversation as we move beyond formulating and really long +1.
I appreciate that, Kate. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and go to Sabrina.
Thanks. Sorry. Thanks. Yeah, I just was hoping to actually sorry, I can't turn my video on maybe. Clarify that question that you were just asking, Juan. I want to make sure I understood it before responding to it. Are you asking, like, should we restart, like, are we not ready to define the problem statement? Or I guess I wasn't sure how you were asking that question.
Yeah, well, I'm really seeking, I think with the discussion that we just had, I think there's a little bit of nuance that could probably be incorporated into each one of these problem statements. But yeah, in short, Sabrina, I'm asking, I heard for the first one that there are barriers that are likely leading towards the centralization of date matching combined, being 99% of the methodology type used. And then I also heard, the entire incrementality discussion talking about, how to address the frequent dispatch of some of these new resources. So it wasn't to change them. It was perhaps a poorly worded way for me to say what I heard was kind of a confirmation of these two. And I was hoping to just hear from the community after we had that discussion, if you felt like these two problem statements should move forward within this working group, so we can start trying to assess ways to deal with the issues that they're capturing. Hopefully I didn't ramble twice there and that made sense, Sabrina.
No, and it's just, and I'll say this is Sabrina Soldovini. I'm Director of Policy for MCE, and so I, filling in for more technical folks. But I think from our perspective, as folks may know, we're early in our VPP efforts and still working through these, but certainly have identified barriers as we work, and some of those are certainly related to baseline methodologies, and so open to exploring changes. And so I guess I think, yes, broad support from MCE for these principles. And to your question, Juan, I think it's more like, should there potentially be some sub-bullets here or some more process to refine those moving forward, maybe just beyond this meeting today. But I think broadly speaking, the points are correct. And I think in particular, from some of this discussion that I've heard on point one, or maybe summarizing from what we just heard, there's underutilization of the current methodologies, but also want to explore, make sure we're preserving the option to create new methodologies in this working group, because I think that's something that we might also be pretty interested in.
And I appreciate that. I don't see them as mutually exclusive, Sabrina, right? Like if the reason that there is such centralization, may in fact highlight, the fact that we may need some alternative approaches. So I appreciate that comment. Thank you. Yelena, do we have anyone else? I know we have a lot of material prepared here.
No other hands right now, but there was a comment in the chat from Jeffrey Guild that said the term accuracy is imprecise on slide 13, as it sounds like more of an issue of choosing the right baseline for incrementality. And then Luke Tugas says that I think this one looks accurate, notwithstanding the nuance that Colin added. And then there's no other hands or chat comments.
I appreciate that. I'm going to take us back to session 0, right? We're capturing the spirit of the principles, the spirit of the, I don't want to get lost in the semantics. Those are well noted. We'll be sure to have those shape our discussion moving forward, but it sounds like we have 2 problem statements to kind of explore a little bit further as we get into the policy development part here. So with that, Ansel, let's go ahead and toss it back to you, and we can keep covering some of the other material.
Thank you, Juan. Great. And thanks for the great discussion from our stakeholders as well. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to dive in a little bit more to kind of the core tenets of our baseline methodologies in our tariff at the ISO. I snagged this great graphic from Resideo that sort of helps envision what we were just talking about in a few comments earlier about kind of how demand response is calculated and how its performance is measured and evaluated. So for some folks, this will be very familiar or information that you deeply grasp and understand. But just as a big picture matter, this illustrates well kind of the blue line represents the base load, and that is the baseline of the load profile for a customer or some kind of element of an aggregation. And the blue line is calculated using the methodologies that I'll touch on the next slide and that we went over in a little bit of detail on the 3rd of March. And then the green line is the incremental difference, as Colin and others were discussing, between that calculated baseline in blue and what was additional curtailment of load during a dispatch event. And so this is load oriented. So I would caution this sort of illustrative example in the context of meter generation output, because that is more focused on generation of a behind the meter resource. But for the purposes of baselines of load curtailment, this is helpful. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we got a couple questions in the comments about kind of what is the origin or genesis of our methodologies for measuring DR performance. And so I'll touch on the NASB element a little bit in a moment, but on the left, we have kind of the 3 core baseline types that the ISO has for demand response in our tariff. And so the control group methodology, which you heard some detailed discussion of from Jahan from PG&E last meeting, is a way of developing a baseline of sort of usual behavior by load using a set of non-dispatch customers which would have similar profiles. So what did some types of customers do who were not dispatched during a period of time when others were dispatched, and you compare the two to develop the incremental difference of curtailed load for the aggregated customers. And then below that, we have the day matching set of methodologies, and this is used to establish a baseline of kind of that usual behavior, again, without DR dispatch, using load data from similar days based on kind of weekday or what would be a similar type of day for performance. So that's looking at those quote unquote non-event days to compare previous days with the day where there wasn't a dispatch event. And then the last box describes our weather matching methodologies, which is similar to the day matching, but looks at non-event days with similar weather instead of looking at day type based on something like day of the week. So we heard folks' comments asking kind of where and how we got to these methods and these baseline sort of core methodologies. And we did draw from industry standards, including the North American Energy Standards Board, also known as NAESB. They have a wholesale electric quadrant, which has a myriad of business practice standards related to wholesale electricity. And number 15 is measurement and verification of wholesale electricity demand response. So if you pull up that document, which is linked below, there is just a description of rules for demand response performance evaluation in wholesale markets, and that is, they provide criteria for demand response that provides various services, so not just energy, but also capacity in other ISOs that have a capacity market, reserves, and regulation. And that describes the baselines and different performance measurements that are appropriate for each of those services, energy, et cetera. So there's more information there. I also wanted to note that I think we used some terminology last meeting about baseline types. So type 1 is just a way to indicate a performance evaluation methodology that is based on a DR resources historic interval meter data, also incorporating other variables like weather and calendar data. So that's speaking to the day and weather matching methodologies. The type 2, I will note, is another kind of baseline methodology that can be used where interval metering is not available for the full population of the customer aggregation. And this is available for use in developing baselines for customers or for aggregations that have customers that don't have the sort of advanced metering infrastructure to provide interval metering data.
Utilizing the, fundamental baselines.
Exactly.
So the base 1 and 2 are really about metering.
Yes.
And metering utilized to develop the control group day matching or weather matching.
Right.
Yeah.
So how can you use the information that you have to still use the three, or develop the baselines based on these three sort of core methodologies? Right. So we'll talk a little bit more about metering generator output a little bit later, but let's go to the next slide.
Well, if we could stay on this a little bit.
Sure,
if there's any questions on this, because again, these are the standards that were developed, and this may get to some of the questions when we started talking about WEIM and different types of methodologies that are out there. This is really about wholesale electricity demand response, measurement and verification as to an energy settlement or a capacity settlement within the wholesale market. So that's why you may see differences between what may have been approved outside of the markets and which are utilized outside of the markets,
Yeah.
and those that are within the markets. And for many years, we were asked, you know, are we following these? Are we following these standards? Do our measurement and verification follow these standards? And it was something that we were kind of held to in terms of, you know, standardized baseline methodologies.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, I like this. Thank you for presenting this.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it does kind of get back to some of, you know, comments that are being made, maybe understanding of, you know, why these kind of methodologies were developed. These were the guidelines that we were following.
Yes. Thank you.
We did expand upon them. So, you know, there's ways to expand upon them. And, you know, we're willing to kind of also continue to look at the expansion of, but trying to stay within the standards. There was a question, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to kind of have a little bit of discussion because we have a stakeholder presentation, I believe, after this. So we can
Yeah, we have a
open
hand
the
from
floor.
Sabrina. Sorry about that, Ansel. We have a hand from Sabrina.
Yep.
Thanks, and sorry, I think you might have just mostly answered it, but confirming that, so any, you know, changes to methodology are required to still meet that, you know, that same standard. Those same standards, sorry.
It may be questioned.
Okay.
You know, we've kind of prospectively, as we've looked at expansion of the different types of methodologies, we've tried to utilize these as a means to say, we're still within this. We're still within these guidelines. These really haven't been updated. This is one of the things, you know, some of our stakeholders have brought up issues that have transpired in just the last few years that maybe these have not considered from the original development of these standards. So I think it just gives the perspective of, you know, where we landed in terms of our offerings. It's not to put any, you know, it's just kind of like those guidelines that we can go by.
Okay.
Yeah, and
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to add, you know, as from my position as a policy developer at the ISO, I think I'm trying to look to our stakeholders to understand, is it time to revisit and to open up, are there ideas for additional kind of baseline methodologies, especially at this core level. I think, you know, there are some tweaks maybe that can be made to what we already have, or, you know, there's a lot of differences between the different look back periods and adjustment factors and other things like that, but these are kind of the core 3 types of baseline that we've been working from. So it doesn't have to be wholesale, or maybe I don't use that word. It doesn't have to be, you know, core additions to this list. It could be, you know, tweaks may be necessary as well.
I think it's just really, hopefully, an understanding of, you know, there were standards developed specifically for wholesale electricity demand response. And that's why you're seeing maybe differences from non-participating demand response programs and their ability to measure in many different ways.
Yes. So these also inform, you know, how other ISOs and RTOs have developed their rules as well. So there's sort of some consistency there.
Okay, there's no other hands or any comments in the chat.
Okay. This is pretty foundational, but you know, worth a discussion. So.
Okay, we have a hand from Nadia Krantz. Nadia, go ahead. We're not hearing you. You may be on a second mute button. Sorry, Nadia, we're still not getting any audio from you. Ahmed, can we try unmuting Nadia one more time? And then if there's, if you can unmute on your line as well, Nadia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I don't know what happens every time. Alrighty. Thank you guys for walking us through this. I just had a generalized question. So I noticed from the last working group meeting that there were a lot of baselines that were developed, and off the top of my head, I remember they were for electric vehicles, and there was kind of like a few different derivatives of different ways to measure those baselines. When you guys were looking at, you know, because the conversation here is that maybe there's small tweaks that need to be made to existing ones, which I would agree with. I'm just curious, when those conversations arise for the electric vehicle ones, and I'm just using that as an example since that's the one that has a lot of different kind of derivatives of it, were those all developed within the same subgroup of performance measurements? As in, were they all developed with small tweaks to, you know, they all use one singular performance measurement and just had like a single tweak to it that was able to accommodate that program?
Right. They were all within the standardized baseline methodologies. I think our major two changes were, even though meter generating output was also part of the wholesale electric quadrant standards, we did recognize behind the meter sub-metering. So the policy really was to say, we're going to recognize sub-metering, and that was the case for EVSE as well. It was more about the foundationally recognition of sub-meters to recognize the contribution of that particular technology, very specifically measured of that technology, to overall curtailment of load. But they both still utilize the general construct of one of these methodologies, day matching, for example.
Okay.
So yeah, so we kind of utilize this as our guide, and then recognize the need to make changes to our original, which was all just day matching, because we added control group, we added weather matching, we had you know, different permutations of day matching, combinations of different types of day matching. Those were all kind of added, but they all kind of fell within this spectrum.
Okay, that's helpful. And then could you go over the NASB baseline type 1 again? I didn't fully grasp what that one was.
Yeah, and so we did also look at, it's really about the type of metering that is available to be able to establish a baseline using one of the methodologies. So the first baseline type 1, they're interval metered. So if you have the load is being interval metered with all of your participating accounts, with all your participants, then that's under that type. The secondary one, and we did do some expanding in this area to allow for non-interval metered baseline development. So it allowed for use of statistical sampling. Maybe you didn't have all of your participants within your program had interval metering. Maybe there was some, a limited number that could be utilized to be able to develop the baseline for the aggregate. So really it's more about the metering and use of metering in developing the baseline.
Okay. Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you. So then if we
Yeah.
looked at kind of one of the presentations from the last one, I believe it was LEAP, we talked about prescriptive baselines. That would essentially be a tweak on the control group methodology rather than adding a whole completely new baseline. Am I understanding that correct?
It could be, yes.
Okay.
I mean, there are some changes. We've already, and I think it was PG&E that did their presentation last time, to changes to the control group method, particularly how it's described within our tariff, because there could be multiple different types of control groups. And so we would have to change some language to kind of open up the use of, you described the prescriptive baselines. There's some other types of prescriptive control groups. And other types of control groups that differ from the tariff language that we currently have. So there is, I don't know if we have the problem statement for that one, but it might be coming in as part of the presentation. But yes, to your point, yes, it's just a change. It would be just changes to, that methodology.
Okay, that sounds good. So it sounds like there is room for not a complete overhaul of a particular methodology. It's just really getting down to a small adjustments here and there for what stakeholders are needing. Okay.
Could be.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yes.
There are no other hands in the queue and no questions in the chat.
All right, let's go to the next slide. I think we have our presentation from Luke at CEDMEC up next. So I think I can hand it over to you, Luke, if you're ready.
Sir, just get myself the one here. Okay, next slide, please. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Luke Tugas. I'm a consultant for the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. I want to thank ISO for the opportunity to present today on device level measurement. I think what we're going to find is that this is kind of a hybrid proposal. It doesn't neatly fit into this, this PEM topic that we're talking today, but it overlaps partially, I'll say. I'm not sure if there's a real home for this one. And so I appreciate ISO giving some time to talk about this. And but it does set up nicely the MJOM proposal, discussion later on. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to kind of level set a little bit here, when smart meters back in the day were deployed, they really enabled a significant, a major step forward for demand response, compared to what it had been, because there are several key benefits, and this doesn't capture them all, of course, but some of the benefits of smart meters for DR included allowing customers to see their historical or real-time hourly or sub-hourly electric usage, also allowing the sharing of customer meter data by customers with demand response providers through the utilities electric rule 24 or 32. Also enabling ISO market integration by providing meter data for settlement purposes. And of course, this last one, the benefit is critical because, as we all know, with a few exceptions, DR performance is measured in the ISO market is measured at the customer meter level. Now, however, as the demand response market has matured quite a bit, especially market integrated DR becomes more, including becoming more widespread among a wider variety of actors. So it's not only utilities, but also DR providers and technology providers even. Several problems have arisen with regard to measuring performance at the customer meter level. And I want to walk through a few here. First of all, the click-through process that some of you might be familiar with that's associated with utilities' respective share my data platforms has been problematic for some time, which has resulted in high customer dropout rates. And I know it differs, for each DR provider, but it tends to be, I generally hear around 50% of customers who try to enroll in a DR provider with a DR provider become frustrated for one, during this process and drop off. And of course, that each customer that drops out of that process is a lost potential customer for, that could otherwise provide demand response into the ISO market. Number two is complete customer meter data are sometimes difficult to get on a timely basis. The ISO has a certain timeline by which DR providers have to deliver their meter data, the customer's meter data as part of the settlement process, and it's sometimes problematic on occasion to get complete and accurate meter data on that when the ISO needs it. Third, and this is very critical, the ISO has limited visibility of behind the meter behind the meter devices. And this really reduces the accuracy of its short-term load forecasting. And for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to click on that link here embedded in the slide. It goes to a really, from my perspective, a very interesting presentation that ISO did on their capabilities and gaps in ability to do short-term forecasting of various types of behind-the-meter devices. And so that was a big, a serious opportunity, I think, for improvement. Then also the current metering, smart meters, they limit customer enrollment to a single DR provider. And so, in other words, each customer can only enroll with one DR provider, but as the industry evolves, we're seeing some DR providers are technology specific, or some technology providers that are also DR providers only deal with their own technology. And so as these smart devices become more prolific, then you're seeing some customers with multiple devices, and we don't want to have a situation where we're stranding some of these devices because the DR provider doesn't work with a particular device. And then finally, the performance of behind the meter devices can be drowned out to a certain extent by factors within a premise, and this can result in less accurate performance measurement as well. Next slide. So getting into the proposal a little bit, so we are proposing this device level measurement in which we would, the ISO would leverage the internal telemetry contained within smart devices, as well as energy storage and EVSE by utilizing their device level data for performance evaluation and market settlement for a proxy demand resources. And before I continue, I just wanted to know, of course, that the meter generator output and the EVSE are already, existing baselines or PEMs, I'll call it that, the ISO offers, but there are some shortcomings to these that would be addressed by this proposal. And so I just want to get that caveat in there to make it clear that we recognize that there's already some elements in place already that could be expanded on. So the key elements of this proposal, and just to be clear, there are no doubt many others, but these are the ones that first came to our mind, is that it would involve modifying the demand response registration system to accommodate a device type and the telemetry data for each device. And then also create a customer authorization process by which customers' devices can be added to the DRS outside of any share my data processes. And just to draw a comparison, the current MGO and EVSE PMs, they require customer authorization through the share my data process. And so what we would propose is that a new authorization or a separate authorization process be created whereby the customer can go directly to the ISO rather than through the utility in order to register their devices. And then some of the key barriers are, or at least one of them is the device accuracy standards. So as we understand it right now, the Metering Business Practice Manual sets a DER device accuracy standard of 0.2%. In the absence of any standards adopted by the local regulatory authority. It's worth noting that the PUC adopted back in 2022 a 2% accuracy requirement for EVSE. I don't recall if the ISO adopted that or not, but I don't think that that applies to MGO. And so anyhow, what we would suggest is that the ISO adopt a 2% accuracy requirement for all devices, with the caveat that, you know, there could be a discussion about whether or not the data needs to be discounted, you know, by an equal amount or something like that, if that makes the ISO feel more comfortable. And then finally, you know, other elements can remain the same. You know, device level data would be, would go through the the validation, editing, and estimating process. I think it is consistent with, you know, the current Metering Business Practice Manual, and of course the existing PMs could continue to use the baselines. I'm sorry, the existing PMs could be utilized by these devices. Next slide, please. So now I just want to walk through some of the benefits as we see it of this proposal. First of all, potential to dramatically increase DR participation in the ISO market. There are a lot of smart devices and behind the meter energy storage EVs that are not being deployed to the greatest extent, to the extent that they can be in California, and then also faster and more accurate measurement of load curtailment that would be facilitated by having direct access to the device telemetry data, and then also improved situational awareness for ISO operators with visibility into the quantity and types of devices that respond to the market signals. And then also allowing multiple providers to serve devices across a premise. So in other words, you could have imagine a customer with multiple smart devices, and with each one with its own DR provider, you know, participating in different programs, for instance. And then finally, it could be used to enforce dual participation restrictions, because the device, each device would be registered in the DRS, registered to a specific DR provider. So there'd be no way to use the same device for multiple programs. Next slide, please. Okay, I won't go through this slide in great detail, but I just wanted to make sure that we made an effort here to show how this proposal fits into the framework that's been established in this working group. And this just attempts to identify the working group topics, the discussion topic, and how the proposal fits within the working group principles. So, for some reading later on for folks if they're interested. Next, please. And that is it. Any questions or comments from folks?
Thanks, Luke. Appreciate the presentation. I think this is a helpful overview of kind of where you're coming from on this. And I would be interested in, you framed the material nicely in this context, but I'm interested in kind of focusing on the key differences between, this sort of true device level metering that you're talking about versus our existing MGO methodology. I think maybe 2 slides back, the sort of problems that you listed on the AMI slide, it sort of covers what you're speaking to there, but can you speak to these changes that you're recommending, or problems that you're identifying directly with how our meter generation output methodology is established?
Sure, sure. And first of all, I'm going to caveat that with saying that I am by no means an expert on wholesale market baselines. And so I'm
Sure.
going to kind of repeat a few of the things as I understand it. And then I have a colleague who can, maybe Colin can jump in at some point as well. But basically, as I understand it, is that the authorization process for a customer to use the MJOM is going to have to go through they have to go through the click through process that the utilities have as part of
Right.
the share my data process, right? So what we have in mind is this being creating a process by which that does not require the utilities, does not impose any sort of role onto the utilities. And so the customer would be registered into the DRRS by the DR provider, and they would be not only would the customer be registered, but they would also be registering their device into the DRRS. Now, it could be this, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it could be a situation is that if a customer does not go through the utility click-through process, then they would not be eligible to participate in DR using their customer, their utility meter data. They would be restricted to whatever devices that they register into the ISO. That would obviously seem appropriate because we don't want to bypass the utilities process if the intention is to use utility data. And then the other difference, as I understand it, is that it's a difference in meter data, meter accuracy requirement as well, I believe. But there's probably others, and I think that's a good discussion to have. Maybe that can inform our discussion later on in this working group session.
Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, I appreciate you, identifying, and they did identify it would require some pretty major changes to the registration system, registration process, particularly with respect to the review process. Again, I don't know if others are aware, but, currently the service account number is kind of utilized to establish ownership of that customer even within our registration system. So this kind of changes the ownership now is more along the device level and less at the service account level. So the service account could be registered and someone's using the load, but there's a desire, I believe, in what you're suggesting, to have the ability to carve out specific devices within the service account and identify those and ensure that they're not being duly compensated under, for that specific service account and for those specific devices that are, performing to curtail. So there has to be some kind of cross checks, and maybe we didn't, in terms of when you start looking at solutions, you'd have to kind of unpack all of that and determine, the appropriate review process or review process changes that might be required to ensure that there's not, dual payment within a specific aggregation of that service account and then aggregation of the devices.
Yeah.
One question I did have was with regard, you did point out the acceptance of some EVSE metering accuracy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's a good point that we'll follow up on. I think we're aware of that. And I think, within our BPM, we could defer to that if necessary. But is there anything that's being done at the device level from an accuracy standpoint? I don't know if it applies to behind the meter energy storage, those same accuracy requirements, and or like you're kind of suggesting its utilization within a device level. Has there been any further exploration of that?
I think it'd be a good discussion to have. I don't have a lot of information to share about that. I think it'd be a good time to, reach out to folks on the line who are, device providers or DER providers who can share maybe some more information on what the accuracy of these internal, telemetry, the internal telemetry is of these devices. I think that would be helpful to hear.
Yeah.
And we've also had a hand from Colin Smith. I think that came up in the middle of this last discussion as well.
Yeah,
Colin, go
just
ahead.
taking. Hey, thanks. Yes, just taking Luke's invitation to jump in. I guess, yeah, to start, I do want to go back to something that Ansel said, which is, focusing on the difference between kind of what MGO and EVSE baselines do and a kind of true like device level measurement approach. I agree it's important to focus on those differences. I would not characterize what is currently done in CAISO to be untrue, right? Like you do have like device level measurement approaches in place, which Luke pointed out in the presentation. Like, these are true examples of device level measurements, but as we kind of saw earlier in the working group, they're not being used to any great extent by the devices that they're built for, right? And so what we're really trying to identify, I think, in or what I'm kind of seeing identified here is not like, we need to move from what exists to a true type of measuring at the device level, but we need to like tweak the EVSE and MGO baselines and identify the components of them that are kind of blocking DER providers from using them to the extent that they were built to be used. And Luke here identified two of the major barriers that I think operators like Leap are really seeing. The first is, the accuracy standards are really built for in CAISO are built for revenue grade smart meters. It's a very expensive proposition for residential batteries, for example, or other DER providers to build devices that meet those standards, or for customers to kind of install equipment that would allow them to meet that standard, nor is it necessarily to the benefit of CAISO to hold DERs to the same kind of standards that exist for larger traditional resources. And so that's one kind of barrier we're seeing, and then the registering outside of the DERRS process. That's something that I think that's a benefit of device level measurements that other programs have been seeing that CAISO is currently not getting in terms of increased enrollments. Like we see in the DSGS, Demand Side Grid Support Program, for example, in some options, batteries are able to enroll in that program directly just by having using their customers' inverter data and sending that to the CEC to measure using a separate authorization process from DRRS. And that's significantly increased enrollment in that program. We could see similar benefits in CAISO if there is a willingness, not even just to create like a new authorization process, but to accept different types of customer authorization, not kind of identifying share my data as the only way a customer is able to express permission that their data is used for demand response. If there's other types of authorizations that can be accepted as legitimate, that could really provide a lot more flexibility for DER providers to create enrollment campaigns and enroll customers in a way that's more intuitive for them than Share My Data currently provides. I recognize the utilities have done a lot of work on Share My Data. I certainly don't want to discount that work that they have done to try to allow customers to share their data easily and effectively. but there is, I think, an opportunity here to increase enrollment in the program as a whole if there is more flexibility in how customers are able to indicate that they authorize their data to be used for settlement in CAISO. There may be some other changes to the tracking process, as Jill mentioned. If a customer is registered under an account number, there would probably be need to be some limitations on them registering individual devices. It might be kind of an either or thing. If a customer registers at the account level, then they can't register at the device level. And if they register at the device level, they have to register each device individually, maybe identifying each device by the account number plus the serial number at the end, rather than just the account number. I feel like I've responded to a lot. I'm probably getting a bit further into weeds than we need to go right at this moment, but I want to kind of emphasize that, what we're hoping to do here is create opportunities to increase the utilization of these baselines that CAISO has already built, and then build on those successes to create potentially similar baselines for other resources that could benefit, or other technology types that could benefit from this type of direct device level participation. And that, a lot of we're happy to engage on some of the operational questions that you all have identified, and are excited to do so.
Appreciate that, Colin. It looks like we have another hand up.
Yeah, let's go ahead and unmute Thomas.
Yeah.
Hello there, Thomas Lee from Darabi. I do want to echo some of Colin's comments about device level data being sort of effective and accepted in other programs like DSGS. A couple of things there in terms of the enrollment process. A number of our customers and other the manufacturers we work with, use the OAuth standard as a way to provide authorization, and and that could easily be rolled into an enrollment process. That's one. On the topic of device accuracy, at least in my experience, many of the manufacturers don't publish those numbers for their sort of default internal meters, but a number of particularly inverter manufacturers do provide an option for a utility grade meter to be installed. It is an extra cost, but it is available. It's typically done for customers who are on power purchase agreements with leasing companies. So they are available, but again, considerable extra cost. So if there's, we can try to find out some of those accuracy numbers, I think, from those manufacturers, and see if some of their default ones will be acceptable. I would encourage us to look toward that. I think the benefits would be tremendous. As Colin mentioned, a considerable level of success, I think, in enrolling customer-sided devices in DSGS I think is evidence of that.
Thomas, you mentioned another process. Was it related to the DSGS program? There is some type of registration of device level information. You called it something. I wasn't able to scribble it down.
There is. So there is actually a software industry standard process called OAuth, O-A-U-T-H. That is a process by which a user can authenticate and provide permission for a third party to access data. So if you've ever seen logged into any of your online accounts and it says log in with Google or log in with Facebook, right? That is the OAuth process. So a similar thing could be done with the device manufacturers. A number of them do support that, and a growing number do. Again, similar a similar process to if you're trying to connect your bank accounts to your personal finance app, right? That process by which you log into your bank account and then your personal finance app has your permission to then access your banking data. It's the same standard.
I did have one question. I don't know if Luke or Thomas or Colin could answer. When we're talking about device level registration, and I do understand the desire to kind of separate that from having to go through the click-through process and get the metering data, that type of data. But is it the intent to kind of still allow for that service account to maybe participate in other programs, demand response programs, absent the device level, curtailment, contribution to curtailment of that? Or is it just saying, we just want to register at the device level? Yes, we still can potentially identify the service account information, but we don't want to go through that whole process of getting access to the meter data.
Well, I think I'll take a first crack at this, and the others can jump in as well. I mean, I don't think that we even contemplated that there would be sort of one or the other kind of approach, and so if the customer wanted to also, after the fact, after registering, let's say, one or more smart devices, they also want to, go through the click-through process and, register the utility meter with the ISO. I don't know I don't think that would be, would be a problem. I mean, probably some discussion would have to be made, to decide how to extract, the separate device performance from the, from any load curtailments that are measured at the meter, at the customer meter. And so that's probably would complicate things a little bit, but I would guess that it's doable.
Yeah, I think Colin maybe piqued my interest because it made it sound like it's just a better measurement, not having to go through, the barrier of the click-through process, and that, there is somewhat ownership of that customer, but just desire to be measured at the lower level, device level.
Well, it depends on each, on the nature of the load curtailment, right? So let's say you have a customer who's, whether they're, doing device level measurement or they're measuring their curtailment at their utility meter, they're, regardless of which way they're doing it, their intention is only to use, let's say 1 or 2 or 3 smart devices, right? But what this allows for is, if they're only using those devices to deliver load curtailment, then there's no need to really register, go through the share my data process, right? If we can create an easier, method or route, for them to register their devices instead. But if you might have customers that have smart devices, but who also have load that they want to curtail that is not, does not have some sort of internal meter or internal telemetry like a smart device does. In which case they would also probably want to, they might also want to register or go through the share my data process as well as registering their devices. But also, the benefit of registering devices, especially if you have multiple devices, is that you could, as I mentioned earlier, be able to go through, participate in multiple programs with multiple DI providers at some point. Obviously, that's probably not something I would expect to be allowed from day one. I know there's a lot of things to think about there, but at least the capability would be there. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know Colin had his hand raised. Thomas still has his hand raised, but it looks like Colin jumped off. Maybe you answered what he was going to say.
Yeah, I'll just add on to just a little bit. I think there are with a sort of demand response works right now, different devices that are eligible for different programs, and so you may in some cases need the meters for certain devices and want to pull the device data for others. Another way to perhaps look at it is also that having the device data in conjunction with meter data can also allow you to actually differentiate the contributions of different devices. So if you have slightly different for maximum participation of all those devices, so it allows us to some additional dimensions of flexibility in terms of how the programs are designed.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else that you have?
Nothing from me.
Anybody else on the team? Questions for Luke? Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Luke.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Luke. Very impressed with how you broke everything down, and appreciate all the discussion around that. Really appreciate your time once more. So maybe if we have no other questions on that, this is a good segue to go to the next slide. Oh, I guess the next one after the presentation from Luke. There you go. So as mentioned, we are interested in further comments on this. We felt this would be a good segue after Luke's presentation, but we just got a lot of good comments and good discussion. So again, just reiterating, what benefits there would potentially be for any needed device level visibility. I think we've heard a lot so far, but I think Ansel is going to get into the meter generator output model and how that is distinguished from our baselines, and that may inform some questions as a result of this discussion too. But really just wanting to capture stakeholder comments that we've heard apart from SEDMEC, right? We see that Voltus did point out that improved sub-metering can help augment current baselines, right? And then as mentioned earlier in the presentation, the NASB standards that Ansel went through, that is also directly related to how this could potentially work for other baselines and sort of specific device level measurements. So maybe before taking any further last questions on this, there's one more slide that we have on it, the next one. So really more broadly, right, should technology-specific problem statements even be needed? Should we have that level of specificity or rather more like a broader, more generic application? And Nostromo, for example, pointed out that thermal storage use of non-energy metered baselines for temp-sensitive units might be needed, as that is an issue in capturing sort of the conversion rate for thermal. So very targeted sort of concern there, but that also hits on why this could be an issue. So with that, I think we've heard a lot, but just want to make sure to wrap that up. Again, thank you, Luke, for your presentation. Any more comments on device level visibility, technology specific, whether that makes sense or more of a broader application?
Yeah, we've got a hand from Kate Unger.
Yeah, I am thinking through as we were trying to articulate our comments the last time. It's very difficult when you have a lot of issues that have a lot of interplay between them, how to tease them out and categorize them. So whether you have a lot of issues that are specific and then there's like a technology that relates to multiple issues, I mean, again, of course, thinking of behind the meter batteries, or whether you think about it in terms of here are behind the meter batteries and here are all the different interrelated issues that need to be addressed to be able to allow this kind of resource to participate. I don't know what's the best answer, but I do know that there is a feeling of things being sort of not coherent when the issues are identified in different places so that they're being considered in isolation when they really do need to be considered in an interrelated way. So I wouldn't want to, at this point, immediately say we should not have technology-specific problem statements. Not that we have to have them, but I think it's too soon to say no.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kate. So that's something where, we're going to ask for comments later after this presentation and this working group. We're not going to really put out a template. I mean, we may just put one out just to specify any comments on the discussion paper. But absolutely, if you think that these problem statements should be organized differently and you think it's largely semantics, we felt we should split them out this way just because they are slightly different and they each might deserve their own attention, right? But yeah, in the end, this is all related, and you make a good point. So that's definitely something. If you think the problem statement should be different or consolidated differently, we're all open to that. But again, we have the discussion paper out there, which is continually evolving, and we're looking to add to that at this juncture, exactly as you sort of outlined, Kate. All right. Any other questions? I think we had a lot of good discussion around this device level issue. I think Jill had it summarized it pretty nicely. Service account level versus device level. That's really the distinction we're getting at here. It sounds like, and appreciate everyone sort of not jumping to solutions, really focusing on what the issue is, so we can really tackle that. But any other final thoughts, questions before moving to the next section?
No hands and no questions in the queue, Jimmy.
All right, great. Well, with that, I think the next slide is the one after this. There you go. So turn it over to Ansel.
Thanks, Jimmy. So we have kind of a specific issue here that I wanted to run through briefly, and then followed by a problem statement. But if folks have other thoughts on the device level problem statements that we just reviewed and technology specific, please, we might be able to find some time to incorporate those if you raise your hand as well. So, all right, let's go to the next slide. So for this slide is pretty self-explanatory. Next slide, please, to slide 20. Perfect. This slide is fairly self-explanatory. It is a quote from 2010 FERC ruling on our filing for the proxy demand resource participation model for demand response. And it speaks to something that we touched on, or that we heard from folks' comments on, related to some policy catalog submissions that we received in 2024, related to how we could incorporate the performance evaluation methodology that we've been discussing into only the BPMs. I should say they're detailed in both the tariff and the business practice manuals. And some of our stakeholders had suggested the idea of including more of the details of the methodologies in the BPM and not in the tariff, keeping the tariff more high level and allowing for more flexibility through just BPM changes. So we wanted to include this slide. I'm not going to read the whole quote from FERC, but essentially FERC's statement in the ruling here speaks to the fact that their conclusion that customer baseline methodologies have a significant effect on rates, as well as terms and conditions of jurisdictional service. And so thus, they insisted that these baseline methodologies should be included in the tariff. So this was, you know, fairly direct advice, and CAISO had to adjust our tariff filing to incorporate this feedback, but this was 15 years ago. I think our kind of staff response to the catalog item suggesting moving the PEMs into the BPM is that it's not something that we wouldn't be willing to consider. It's, you know, we provide this citation just to give folks context for where FERC has been on this issue, but noting that, you know, if this is a significant problem, which some stakeholders have raised, then it could be discussed as kind of revisiting the inclusion of the methodologies in the tariff. I'm sorry, in the BPM. So
I think it does set, and we talked about this a little bit earlier,
yeah,
that there will have to be some within the tariff. I think what we're kind of leaning toward is that we can't just completely remove them from the tariff, yeah, and have everything in the BPM. At least that's one approach. That's one approach that we, you know, we're not sure if that's the desired outcome. Yeah. But I think we're kind of laying this out a little bit to say we might have some flexibility. Yeah. But just a wholesale, everything in the BPM, allow for so much flexibility that we just come in and do all kinds of different methodologies and have them in the BPM is probably, you know, on a higher risk level. But, yeah, you know, just wanted to lay this out foundationally. Exactly, exactly. So that's kind of some context and history. I think we can jump to the next slide, in which we've tried to capture sort of this issue. So I'll hand it to, I think, Juan for this one, and then we can take some discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ansel. And again, you know, I think it is something to explore. But what Jill just mentioned, you know, we talked a little bit about our DRS system. We're talking here about regulatory risk, policy risk, and implementation risk. These are things that we're later on in this working group going to continuously be taking a look through those lenses. And I think this is just highlighting an item that might have kind of a higher regulatory lift here. But the problem statement that we had heard from our stakeholder community, and we're hoping to kind of get some confirmation, so is that FERC has shown a reluctance to move baseline methodologies into the BPMs, and that limits the CAISO's ability to frequently adapt that framework to meet evolving market needs. And, you know, this is kind of reflective of the alternative baseline comments that we received, as well as just some direct comments of moving this to the BPM and not having it in the tariff. And I think Jill laid out, or Jill, if I heard you correctly, you know, we could just move all of it into the BPM. That's the guidance that Ansel just went over. But you know, we could continue to kind of explore that flexibility. So looking for this community to let us know if this is a problem statement that resonates with you, and if further exploration of to what extent that flexibility exists is something you'd like the working group to take on. So I'll pause here, and I would love to hear any thoughts on this item.
Yeah, Juan, thank you. Just before we hear from the stakeholders, I wanted to sort of speak to the historical context a little more. Though that filing was from 15 years ago, and that was thus a pre-Western Energy Imbalance Market world, in any case, the statements that FERC made are still relevant to the settlement of wholesale energy, whether or not it's, you know, CAISO PDRs participating in CAISO markets pre-WEIM or beyond our BA. So I think it's, you know, just recognizing that FERC's interest there is still, you know, I'm not an attorney, but it's still relevant to energy markets across the West. But it's still, what we had caveated is still, you know, it may be worth exploring again, so.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Hansel. No, I appreciate that. Elaine, do we have any comments or hands up?
Yeah, Luke's got his hand up. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for kind of giving this information about, for, past FERC direction. That was obviously a while ago, not something I would have expected to remember, or anyone else for that matter. So I appreciate you doing that. One thing that I was thinking is that, I would agree that just wiping the tariffs from the, or even mention of the tariff, from the baselines from the tariff is, probably not going to be workable. But I'm wondering if there's a way to kind of make the language more generic, perhaps, in the tariff, whereby, because I think the purpose behind this proposal or we're in the problem statement stage. The problem is that there's not enough flexibility to make course corrections along the way, easily to baseline, to the different PEMs. And I think we want to create more flexibility there. And so the question is, how can we do that? And so if by having more generic language in the tariff, that maybe creates categories of baselines of PEMs, for instance, without being overly specific about what what they look like exactly. Maybe that's a way to do it. But anyhow, to your question, we do see this as something that would be, I think, very useful going forward, because there's a lot of issues, as we all know, that we're talking about in this working group, and I think there's going to be a lot of fine tuning that's going to be required over time. And we want to preserve that flexibility.
Thanks, Luke. I appreciate that. I'm hearing really just a way to be able to react a little bit quicker. So I appreciate that. Sabrina, I see your hand. Let's go ahead and go to you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think, probably generally in agreement with the sentiment from Luke. I do think, as the market continues to transform, having some flexibility is likely helpful to not have to go through, the full tariff change process. It's definitely a balance that we want to strike there, of course, but I do think some flexibility will be important, so that as we continue to get more learnings and really, as things change, we aren't unnecessarily slowing ourselves down and limiting ourselves. But then at the same time, sorry, to this kind of a tangent here. I just wanted to make sure, am I understanding your, or actually, could you explain the first sub-bullet there on alternative baselines, what you mean in that sub-bullet there?
Yeah, so I'll take first crack, and the rest of the team feel free to jump in. But right now, if there are some alternative baselines, if we were to explore the creation of a new baseline, I think it's related here, because if the idea is to move everything to the BPM, right, would we put a new baseline into the BPM and into the tariff? And I think that's the trade-off we're trying to show, right, is that we had received that guidance that is still relevant today, as Ansel put it. So just wanting to highlight that as we explore alternative baselines, it's kind of tangentially related to this problem statement. Jill, Ansel, anything you would like to add there?
Yeah, no, I think we were just summarizing some comments there. It is an interesting question of, if we're talking in a policy initiative in the future about a new kind of baseline or changes to the existing, we want to hear if it's worth trying to only include those changes or new baselines in the BPM, or, you know, how would we get there basically? And how do we get to solving this problem statement? Sort of through the process of additional baselines that we might consider through future initiatives, or otherwise.
I think we see the.
Yeah, and I'll also recognize, Jill and I were recognizing a comment in the chat related to kind of, you know, there are other parts of our tariff that specify policy at a higher level, and then the BPM is used to kind of provide detailed information about implementation or other details. That's kind of the spirit of the tariff BPM relationship as I see it. And so a way to do this could be just repeating a comment in the chat saying the tariff can be used to define the broad approach to calculating each baseline and then more operational detail in the BPM. So that could be an approach.
Yeah. And I think that's why we were trying to kind of set up how the perspectives we've had in the past, where foundationally you have certain types of baselines, and if we're looking at some new alternatives, can they fit with just modifications or slight changes to those, and those details could be in the BPM. If it's a completely new, doesn't really fit into any of those categorizations, then I think we have to, you know, think about, and this gets back to an earlier problem statement, think about, do we want to have these very specific technology type, because then that takes us away from having something a little bit more genericized with details within the BPM. So it's just kind of looking for stakeholders to kind of think of these things in terms of, you know, the standardization that's been kind of handed to us and we followed, which we can, you know, we can go outside those guidelines. And then some of the earlier rulings by FERC that we can kind of utilize their viewpoint, but also address the larger problem statement of wanting to have, you know, the more flexibility in changes to methodologies, available methodologies. But we have to kind of think of the approach. How are we going to approach this?
Yeah. And what I heard from, I think it was, yeah, what we heard from Luke was, I think it was Luke, was maybe focus the problem statement more on the second sort of clause that we have here. It says limiting CAISO's ability to frequently adapt its framework to meet evolving market needs. And maybe the problem statement, you know, from that sort of base level problem comes solutions related to how we structure the proposals and the filings. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ansel. Let's go ahead and go to Kate.
Thanks. A lot of good things you all have said. I think the idea of having something more general in the tariff and then being able to more clearly delineate things in the BPM seems like a good approach. That said, and recognizing that this is guidance that generally still makes sense, I was somewhat curious whether you have surveyed whether FERC has given similar guidance to other ISOs or RTOs more recently, or, you know, are they still in the same place? It might be nice to just kind of get that baseline sense of that. Though, again, as I say, I think the general approach of having something in the tariff makes sense. And then I did just also want to point out, because I think you have a very good point, you don't want to be putting tariff language in that's technology specific. And going back to my comment about technologies in the problem statements, I don't think that having technologies in the problem statements means that the actual proposals or tariff or BPM language that comes out of it needs to be technology specific.
Thanks, Kate. I appreciate that. It does sound like...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
There was a comment in the chat from, it's been a number of minutes, but it was something that Luke had said earlier, and Colin Smith said that he agrees it'd be worth exploring if the tariff could be used to define the broad approach to calculating each baseline and then provide the operational details and the BPMs. So I just wanted to read that before we went too much further.
No, I appreciate that, Yelena. So I'm going to actually see if I can't get some buy-in here, right? I think it's the latter half of this problem statement that really seems to resonate and might be what the working group is wanting this initiative and this DGEMI team to tackle. And I'm hearing quite a bit less about just moving it out of the tariff and where it is, but just being able to address the need to adapt a little bit more agility, right? To be able to adapt the framework to meet the evolving market needs. So I'd like to put that problem statement out to this stakeholder community and see if that's something that we can get some consensus around, and potentially we're able to kind of off-ramp that into the further discussions in the future of trying to figure out solutions as to how we might be able to provide that additional flexibility. So does anybody have any issue, or would anybody be opposed with, in essence, the problem statement being a need to allow for the more frequent adaptation of frameworks to meet evolving market needs, and however it is that we end up, as Ansel put it, could be a solution, could be the filing strategy. Much more to come, and there's a lot more granularity for us to dive into a little bit later. But does that sound like the problem statement to this community? Is anybody opposed? Could I get some hands if you feel like that is something that we should not try to move forward with? Kate, I'm not sure if that's I'm assuming it's an old hand, but I'm going to go to you just because I'm seeing you on the right-hand corner of my screen.
That's an old hand. Sorry about that. I do agree with you.
No, all good. Okay, I appreciate that, Kate. Thanks. Sabrina, I saw your hand go back up.
Yeah,
there's also a request. There's also a request to repeat the problem statement again in the chat.
Yeah, of course. So in essence, the problem statement is to address or increase the CAISO's ability to more frequently or in a more agile way adapt framework to meet evolving market needs, as opposed to where this started, which is what we heard from our stakeholder community, which was just move everything out of the tariff into the BPM, which I think, as I heard the discussion between our stakeholders and with Ansel and with Jill, I think we've really kind of centralized around, it's really the ability to change some of those details and perhaps a different mechanism than just the tariff language. But, really the core issue or problem statement we're addressing is just the ability to be agile and frequently adapt that framework. So Sabrina, why don't we go ahead and go to you?
Yes, no, I think that was helpful clarification. I think, obviously I know I said basically what you just said. So I generally agree with that being like the problem statement, but I wanted to, like, process wise, just make sure, like, before we, this group agrees on that and moves it out of the SI, we probably want to, that we're not precluding folks from, like, commenting on it in the process, just so we get, like, all folks, opinions versus this kind of like, this is the only moment to make that decision. Because I'll even say for me, like, right, I want to probably confirm with folks internally that that's 100% what we would want to be the position moving forward. But in terms of like a draft problem statement, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, no, Sabrina, I think you're right. And one of the things I'll kind of highlight is, as the working group kind of progresses and we get to, let's say, the draft problem statement is agreed upon, we will be putting out further iterations of our discussion paper. And so there will be opportunity to comment there, but really kind of the spirit of it is less about moving it from the BPM to moving it from the tariff to the BPM, and more about just ensuring that agility is kind of what I'm hearing and what would be reflected in the discussion paper. And you definitely have an opportunity to comment on that.
Got it. Thank you.
You got it. Luke, I'm not sure if you have an old hand or not, but is that a fresh hand? Oh, okay. So I'd go down. So we've got a couple of others in the chat. TJ I see this was a couple minutes ago. Can you repeat the problem statement again? Hopefully you followed my rambling ways. Nadia, Pacific Core agrees with.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
There was one above it too
Go
that
ahead.
Colin Smith said that the language sounds good too, right above TJ's. So that was the first.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all right. Go ahead. Go ahead, Galena. Do we have anything else in the chat here?
Yeah, so there was Colin agreeing. Then Nadia said the Pacific Core agrees. Sorry, you had started with that one too. To agrees to reframing the problem statement to have more adaptability for baselines. John Kitchen said that PG&E is hoping we could run through a scenario explaining how a baseline methodology is applied and talk through why it may be different and may not be applicable to EIM entities compared to aggregators or utilities under CAISO's BA. And then Jennifer Back says CalCCA agrees with the proposed modifications to the tariff versus BPM to allow for more flexibility for PEM modifications.
Great. Okay, great, very good. And again, we will reflect this. So to the question on, I want to make sure that we don't just move through. So John, the scenario of how baseline is applied. Ansel or Jill, do we want to maybe expand on this comment? It's a little bit outside of the tariff to BPM conversation, but really, why it's this last part in particular, kind of talk through why it may be different and may not be applicable to EIM entities compared to aggregators or utilities under CAISO's BA. Can we unpack that one a little bit, Jill? Yeah.
Again, I think that it might behoove us to have a additional conversation with John. He's had some great comments here, and so we're willing to kind of go offline. I do just kind of want to lay out, within our presentation, we're really trying to, to highlight there are differences between participating demand response and requirements under participating demand response and some availability of, WEIM participants to represent their demand response programs within the EIM, the WEIM. And, we tried to showcase that PEMs really aren't applicable to WEIM participants that are utilizing, that option, that's optionality that's available to them. So really, PEMs are very specific to participating demand response, not non-participating demand response. And the PEMs, were established based on, we identified the NASB, which kind of laid out the guidelines for the PEMs and the baseline. So really, those were established for wholesale participation, wholesale market participation. So we don't see a difference if you are a WEIM participating in the wholesale market under, as a PDR, RDRR, or if you are in the DER aggregation. So that's why we're not differentiating that. Following those PEMs developed out of those foundational standards, as well as, I think there was a third point I'm trying to make. I can't remember my third point that I'm trying to make. So I don't think there is, a difference in applicability to EIM entities once they're within this box. We're talking about this box.
Yeah. And we would be interested to hear if.
And we've seen some comments, and we've seen his comments. So we're interested in understanding the perspective maybe that John is having. And I think we saw others' comments reflect that. But that's it's kind of how we're laying out this presentation to really focus on this box in terms of applicability.
And so that's to say, Joe, like maybe put a different way, the PEM that's applied for PDR, which could be in WIM, right? It's not about applicability of the PEM. It would be the same PDR PEM as regardless
Yeah.
of where you
Oh,
are
I think,
located.
and then the third point was really when we laid out, FERC's coming back to us saying, this reflects rates, terms, and conditions of your, of this participating resource, of this participating supply side resource. Therefore, this needs to be within the tariff. So all of those are applicable if you're operating under these market participation models highlighted here.
Okay.
But we're
Thanks.
open to having further discussion if there are, differences and understanding them. Okay.
Yelena, anything else in the chat or in queue?
Nothing, no hands, nothing in the chat.
All right. Well, with that, I'll hand it back off and we can go to the next slide.
Okay, before we start this section here, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break since everybody's been here for a few hours, and then we're going to come back at 26 after.
Thank you.
Okay, we're at time. How are we looking, Juan?
We're looking great. We have Ansel back again. Really, we really appreciate the discussion here. Two things kind of came to mind while we were on break as I was just kind of looking back on what we discussed. That there was a comment from Sabrina. You know, we do highly encourage this organic conversation, this interactive kind of nature of it. We are, of course, going to, and just reiterating, we will reflect that in the discussion paper. There will always be that ability to provide additional comment. And then I always feel free to reach out to us offline as well, right? If there's something that you'd like to add or to discuss further, we're always happy to meet as well. So while I am strongly encouraging the engagement here, please understand it's not the sole engagement. That's all. I am going to go ahead and I see both Ansel and Jill in the room. Let's kick it back off. Ansel, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Juan. Let's go to the next slide. So we only have about a half hour, but we have an item on the metering generator output, as well as on control group methodologies. So we'll try to kind of get through both of these items in the time we have. So I'm just going to take a little time to walk through in detail more information about what the MGO performance evaluation methodology is. So at a fundamental level, this methodology is provided to evaluate device performance based on actual physical metered generator output of a device that is behind the meter, if you will, from the customer account. So this flow process diagram details kind of how all the elements come together in order to produce a demand response energy measurement via the MGO methodology. A note on terminology, in the NASB standards, it's metering generator output. I think the CAISO BPM says meter generator output. Yeah. There's a little bit of a change slightly. Yeah, there's been a little bit of a change, but MGO is the general term for this. So on the left square, we have kind of the distinction that's made in MGO. It separates between the customer response at the kind of facility level, if you will, and the behind the meter generation or device response. So when we use the word location, that is a term that refers to the utility customer account, and this methodology describes how DR at each location can be separated into the overall response at the load meter, and then the separate device response, which is metered separately. So then once you kind of break out those two elements using the sub-metering process, the device response is compared to a baseline of that device's behavior, as we discussed earlier, to determine the incremental response of that sub-meter device. So that, in this case, is most cases we're thinking of behind-the-meter storage, in which case it would be discharging is the response that we're trying to figure out the baseline level for. So how, what is a battery behind the meter doing on sort of a normal day, if you will, without a CAISO dispatch? And then what is the incremental response after the CAISO dispatch compared to that baseline? And that baseline is calculated by looking back at previous days to look at usual behavior based on non-event hours in which the device is not dispatched by the ISO. So there's a lot more information about this sort of formula in the business practice manual for demand response, including kind of what there's a term called G load modifying, which represents the baseline, if you will, the typical behavior of the behind the meter generating device. Let's go to the next slide. So after this slide, we have an example of how MGO is calculated, but I just want to run through a few things here. So LEAP's Colin Smith's presentation in March, the sort of high-level proposal that they were sharing would allow DERs to dispatch more frequently, moving from emergency to baseload resources. So what is it about this frequent dispatch that's not captured in MGO methodology? So essentially, if a resource is dispatched by the ISO in most or all of the previous 45 days that are looked at to get to this baseline calculation, and thus there are no available non-event hours, you know, given that every day is an event day, in our business practice manuals, we have a feature that allows the baseline to be set to 0 for that period. So if a device is dispatched by the ISO over and over, and there's no way to figure out what the incremental dispatch is for that day, then we just assume 0 baseline, and any response from above 0 is allowed used to calculate performance. I also wanted to make a note on exports. So I want to keep us in the frame of performance evaluation methodologies here and when we're thinking about exports, and note that the formula for MGO in the business practice manual, it could be amended or tweaked to essentially accommodate exports. So currently, the formula has a floor of 0 for exporting energy, in the sense that any behind-the-meter device response is capped at the customer overall load level, which essentially does not allow, if you have, for example, a battery that could discharge at a higher level over customer load during that dispatch hour, that would be negated under the current formula. But there could be a change to that. It would just be a change in one of the terms in the formula to allow for additional export on top of that. However, we're still just talking about the methodology for the baseline. So this, if we made this change, there would be other implications beyond just the baseline. So there would be transmission system deliverability considerations, as well as sort of implications to local regulatory authority processes. So that's kind of, there's a lot there. I might go to our example, and then we can come back to this slide maybe for a little bit of discussion if need be, and then go to the problem.
Yeah, I think this does get to an earlier question that we had. I mean, the way that we framed MGO and you know, kind of looking more at the frequent dispatch and kind of put that aside versus the exports, because we recognize exports is a big part of it, could be accommodated.
Yeah.
A lot of other implications beyond just the PEM discussion.
Exactly. So let's go to the example slide, the next slide, please.
And I do want to recognize, maybe on that one, when we put this together, when we were thinking about frequent dispatch, because we heard that last time on the March 3rd.
Exactly.
I think it was clarified earlier that we were thinking about it just a frequent dispatch. When we think of dispatch, we think of ISO dispatch.
Right.
I think earlier I heard comments that they're kind of categorizing frequent dispatch to be inclusive of non-ISO dispatch. MGO is very specific about ISO dispatch.
To establish the baseline.
To establish the baseline.
Yeah.
So we don't recognize non-ISO dispatch of the behind the meter resource.
Right. In the sense that
we don't consider that a dispatch.
It is not an event day.
Yeah, it's
whatever,
a non-event day.
whenever there's no CAISO dispatch.
Yes.
It is a non-event day.
Yes.
Okay, so quickly to run through this example, just to put into words what we discussed 2 slides ago. So to figure out how this all comes together, in this example, the ISO has given a dispatch signal to provide 100 kilowatt hours for a behind the meter, or for a, or that was the dispatch that was received for an individual customer
It's
as a part of
to reduce load by 100 kWh.
Exactly.
Which would translate to a discharge.
Yes, for a behind the meter storage resource. So the second line on the top right there, metered output at 130 kilowatt hours. So that is the customer overall load.
That's
I'm sorry.
the sub-metered.
That's right. That's the
Generator
sub-meter generator output for the sub-metered device. And then in order to determine how much the device needs to generate, the baseline must be calculated. So that's the 30 kilowatt hour mark at the bottom of the stack there. And that is calculated how we discussed earlier. So basically, what is the device normally doing when it's not being dispatched by the ISO? In this case, we look back up to 45 days to determine 10 non-event days. So those 10 numbers on the chart at the bottom indicate days that were drawn upon for non-event days, and then that specific hour is looked at within each day.
It is by hour, yeah.
So in this case, you're looking back at these 10 days that were non-event days, and the sub-metered device was generating at various levels on each of the days, 75, 25, et cetera, and those are drawn upon to calculate the baseline at 30 kilowatt hours to represent typical behavior. We can also point out that there are a few days where you'll see a negative number, and that represents charging for a behind the meter storage resource. And those days are not permitted to be included in the calculation of the baseline for various reasons, or for reasons that were
yeah, they're not used in the averaging of the baseline.
Right.
So they're not applicable. Even though it was a non-event day in the look-back period, we just, if it's charging.
We're only looking at generating
we're only looking at baselining
discharge.
the discharge, the generator.
Right, but 0 days are included. So if there's no activity from the sub-meter device, then that is included in the average.
Correct.
But then the orange text at the bottom is something that I stated earlier, just indicating that if there aren't enough non-event days, if all of those 45 days the account was receiving a dispatch from the ISO, then the baseline is 0, and the device would be including 0 as anything above 0 as the incremental dispatch to meet that 100 kilowatt hours. So hopefully this is a helpful representation of kind of how MGO uses a kind of a baseline methodology to calculate generation on dispatch days.
Couple points. It's really to determine incrementality.
Exactly.
So this is how we viewed incrementality.
Right.
It's not incremental to another customer's usage. It's incremental to the aggregation, you know, those customers within the aggregation, how they're typically performing day to day versus how they performed based on an ISO dispatch. So
it's more like a day matching in that sense, but not technically. It's a different construct from those other.
The only way we're using a baseline is to determine, you know, the output incrementality.
Typical behavior.
Yeah, is the typical behavior. And I think the secondary point is we consider frequency of dispatch, because this did come up when we were developing this particular methodology, that, hey, we might have, being in the market, being dispatched by the ISO, these, we're going to be there every day, kind of behaviorally being dispatched by the ISO. Well, that is considered within this methodology. If it's just frequently dispatched, there's not enough baseline information within that 45 look back period, then it eventually sets that baseline to 0. So all of it is considered incremental dispatch.
Yes. Okay, so that was a little bit more detail on the MGO methodology. Maybe we can go to the problem statement slide, and then we can go back to those slides as needed. So let's go to the next slide, and I can hand it to our facilitator.
Oh, wait, that's control.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe it's the next one.
I believe we have, I don't think we have a problem statement drafted for MGO, actually. Does that sound right, Jimmy?
Yeah, that's correct. I think we wanted to really just kind of give context of how the MGO interplays with everything.
Yes.
To Kate's comment about exporting, things like that. So just to help inform folks. Yeah.
Yeah, and so some of them, they're related. They're related problem statements in the beginning of our meeting from the overall baseline methodology calculation. So, okay. Yelena, did you have something there?
Yeah, sorry about that. Kate Unger has her hand up.
Yeah. And let's go back 2 slides, maybe.
Okay, let's go to Kate.
So actually, you might want to go to the example. That's what I just wanted to ask some clarifying questions to make sure I understood it correctly. So 2 questions, I'll ask them, and then the first one is, if I understood, then if there are only 9 days out of the 45 that that could be used, then that would be considered a 0 baseline. Shall I ask them both, or do you want to answer that one and then I'll ask the other?
So if there are only 9 non-event days in the previous 45 days, I'm sorry, that can still be, those days can still be used to create an average.
There is, I don't know if it was in the notes or where, I thought we talked about minimums. There's a target and a minimum.
Yeah, there is the ability for, depending on the day type, if it's a weekday, 10 days should be looked at with a 5-hour minimum. So if there are more than 10,
more than 5.
I'm sorry, if there are more than 5, then however many can be used, or will be used.
Up to 10.
Up to 10.
I think it's once you get to the minimum,
yeah,
then it sets it to baseline.
it's just those 5 days and the respective hours. Does that make sense?
So is the answer that it's only a 0 baseline if there isn't a single non-event day in the past 45 days?
There's a minimum.
It would be fewer than 5, I think, if it's a weekday, or fewer than 4.
If it's a weekend.
If it's a weekend, yeah.
Okay, great. And then did I understand you to say if there is negative, there's actual charging on a day, it's not that the negative number is turned into a 0 and counted, it's just that the day is not included?
It's not included.
That's right. It is not incorporated as a non-event day.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, and there's also a comment in the chat asking about that, the negative numbers. I don't know if we want to
Where's the chat?
get into, it's just asking why charging days are not included as a part of the average, the baseline average.
Yeah, we did look at that, and we found that it could incentivize behaviors not consistent with what we wanted to see.
Yeah.
Yeah. It could be utilized to reduce your baseline significantly and charging potentially in periods where we're actually looking for, discharge.
Right.
it was something we looked at in one of our initiatives, and it was found to be, incentivizing wrong behavior.
Mm-hmm. And negative effects were sort of came out of that, so. Okay. Perhaps I can run through the control group slide as well. Let's go forward one slide. Yeah, perfect. So this is our last topic for today. Just wanted to run through some points related to the presentations that we heard at our last working group meeting in March. And then we do have problem statements drafted for this in the next slide. So just a point is that we heard was, I'm sorry, at a base level, the tariff and BPM do require registration of control group customers into our demand response registration system, even if they are not enrolled in a DR program. There are various reasons for why registration is required for these control group customers, but that is the current requirement to develop a control group, is to have registration of those customers. So what we heard from stakeholders was, potential to consider the removal of that requirement for matched control group customers who are not part of a program, a DR program at all, but have to be registered in order to create the control group for, to compare performing customers against. And so we just wanted to identify some challenges with that idea. There are ways to overcome these challenges, but they exist. So one of the problems, going back to the reason why we require registration is verifying that the customers in the control group, they're supposed to represent non-participating customers, so we need to verify that they haven't been registered in other DR programs. So they get registered so that we can see that they are a part of the control group and can't be registered elsewhere. And then a second challenge is we just need information about those control group customers and to make sure that they are real customers that are registered with the utility distribution company, so that that can be verified. I think, I also was thinking about the LEAP presentation in March, and kind of, the idea of a prescriptive baseline is not, it's not technically a control group methodology, because it's just not by definition. If you have a sort of average baseline calculated across a certain geography or customer group, that's different from looking at a specific group of customers that serve as an actual control group to compare against. But it's sort of a similar idea to compare against, okay, what is a normal customer doing on a non-event day if they're not part of this specific program? But that also, that sort of solves some of these challenges in some ways potentially, but also creates other challenges with verification and related issues. So just wanted to highlight those, but noting that these are, again, there could be ways to deal with these challenges, but wanted to highlight them. So we can go to the next slide and take a look at our drafted problem statements related to this. So
there is a comment. There's a comment in the chat if you're ready for that.
Okay. Maybe I misunderstood. I'll have to go back and check. I see Noor's comment.
Yes.
BPM does set that to 0 in the intervals in which the behind-the-meter generation is charging.
Okay, so it could be included.
It could be. We might have made a late adjustment on that.
Okay.
I may be using an old example.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah.
We'll verify that and make sure we get that corrected.
All right. I'll hand it to Jimmy to review our draft problem statements in our remaining time.
So, Ansel. Yeah, we only have about 10 minutes left, so should be quick if you don't mind going to the next slide. So as Ansel just mentioned, just kind of outlining the registration requirements. this is what we sort of heard primarily from SEDMEC, and this kind of ties into their earlier presentation, right, of device level measurement, but a little bit different, just given that we're focusing more on the registration aspect. So more of a sort of procedural process type problem statement that we sort of spliced out. Again, if folks think this should be lumped in with others, or if we think it's appropriate, open to those thoughts and any other thoughts on that. As you can see, SEDMEC sort of outlined, stress, I should say, the reliance on utility meter data, the cumbersome process, and the strict metering, requirements that sort of play into all of that. So looking for any further thoughts here in these final moments to just sort of build on what Ansel mentioned and everything else we've discussed today as it relates specifically to sort of the registration click-through requirements and things like that, if we can focus on, to the extent we can focus on those.
Okay, we've got a hand in the queue. Let's go to Ben Dawson.
Hey, this is Ben Dawson from DMM. This has been a great conversation today, and you invoked us a little bit earlier, and I just wanted to make clear that DMM is recommending that we don't include more baselines if possible, and a number of refinements can be made to the existing baselines, and it seems like we're working on those. And if we don't need to move around, but I'm going to speak to them. On slide 14, we're pretty sure that that is the universe of, quote, counterfactuals in the way in which you would calculate a kind of load performance baseline. And my background is PhD economics, and this is how we do look at, in energy economics, this is how we look at counterfactuals, and I think you've captured those very nicely. The way in which you articulated in slide 12, the counterfactual is important for us to keep in mind, and the counterfactual being the baseline. In slide 15, again, you've really captured the universe of counterfactuals nicely, and you invoked us earlier and insinuating maybe there may need to be additional baselines, and I think one of our concerns is that there is such so many parties are using one particular baseline, and PG&E brought up in March that we could be using the control baseline more effectively. And I think we should really look at that more closely, because this is actually how we create these counterfactuals in a statistical environment. And to work on refinements there, I think would generally be valuable. And the importance of doing that, though, is we should be looking for a like for like, which is the way in which we speak about it in the BPM and tariff. But I just want to highlight that making sure that we're really finding a like for like as we pursue additional changes to the control group approach would be valuable. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ben. I really appreciate DMM weighing in after you guys have had a chance to sort of digest the entire discussion and crystallize your thoughts. So I think that's where we're at, right? Starting back in that first problem statement, does it merit any further baselines, given that they seem to be underutilized now? Because if we can improve the existing baselines to address all of the concerns that we've heard today, I think that would be the great balance we are trying to strike here. And to the extent that can't work, I think that's what we're trying to figure out. So I just jotted down your notes here about slide 14, 12, and 15, and we'll take a look at that, following the meeting and any comments after the meeting today. But that's really great input. I think that's kind of summarizes where we're at very nicely. Any
Kaisa? We're happy to hear from DRPs too. So if there are folks that want to talk about this as well, DMM is also always we just put out our report. We're willing to hear your thoughts on our report and where we're headed directionally here.
Great plug. Yes, that's awesome for folks to note. The DMM report is very informative. We do encourage folks to check that out. very nicely highlights the market challenges and where some of the sticking points are from DMM's perspective. So that's something we can definitely be sure to look at.
And Jimmy, we have a hand from Perry Servadio as well.
Yes, thanks, Perry. Go ahead.
Hey, this is Perry Servadio, CISA. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. It was actually a question for DMM. I was, we spent some time reading over their comments, but we were still puzzling over their conclusion to be against pursuing new PEMs where those PEMs could unlock more market participation from demand response resources. So we're hoping they could describe in better detail here why they're against pursuing new performance evaluation methodologies.
Thanks, Perry. Any thoughts from DMM on that?
Yeah, no, the comments from DMM really read as nobody's using all of these, so therefore we don't need any more. Yeah, and that was a bit troubling of a read to hear, because typically through these processes we try to focus on what is the issue that is preventing people from using those, why are those not being used, and then tackling those issues. So I didn't want, so as I understood it, it was, the comments were that the current ones are not being used, therefore we don't need any more. And is that a good summary of DMM's position on this?
I think it would be better put saying there would be value in enhancing what already exists versus generating new ones.
Okay, so I do recall from the last working group some presentations by both Nostromo, LEAP, and PG&E, and some of those presentations did discuss new PEMs. Am I to interpret this as you'd be against new PEMs solving the issues that they laid out as well?
I would say that I think we have the ability to incorporate the PEM.
Thanks. Thanks, guys. I think the what I'm taking away at least is if there is value in exploring the existing PEMs to accommodate all of the challenges we're hearing today, and that would get to what Perry and everyone else is sort of concerned about, let's all do that, right? And if they're not, I think DMM sounds like if the existing suite is not able to capture the characteristics and the responsiveness, dispatch issues, device level management, things like that, everything we've talked about, if it's not, then would it be fair to say that DMM is open to new baselines at that point? Again, assuming any current refinements to the existing suite of baselines wouldn't capture the concerns we've heard today.
And Ahmed, can you unmute Ben Dawson? Ben, if you go ahead and put your hand up,
All right,
we can.
I think I'm back now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, I think we need to be very attentive to how we think about these new baselines. And that was the accuracy and efficiency comment that was invoked earlier. And I think we need to be very cautious in the way in which we think about implementing or developing new baselines. And I do understand, and I have a paper from my PhD even on it, thinking about EV charging and what the counterfactual is. So I'm very sympathetic to this and would like to flesh this out, but I think we need to be, my position number one is that we already have the ability to do this. And my position number two is that if we are going to develop new baselines, we need to be thoughtful about the way in which we do this and have a good stakeholder process as we've had today and will continue to.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think
We
that.
have a hand. Do you have time
Yeah,
for
go
one
ahead.
more hand, Jimmy?
Yep, go
Okay,
ahead.
Sabrina.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I actually thought I lowered my hand, but quickly, I'll just say, I put this in the chat, but just to say too, I think maybe we're talking past each. I'm wondering if some of us is talking past each other, because I will say I'm a little unclear on what constitutes a new PEM and then what's an enhancement, or like how far can an enhancement go before it's new? And that's one of the things I'm unclear about. So maybe it's something we could explore down the line. And then I just wanted to say, and it looks like we're going to run out of time to talk about this slide, but I do think this problem statement probably, warrants some further discussion. I'll just say one note quickly from like the CCA perspective is that we might have a little bit different of perspective than, the IOUs or other DER providers on this issue. I think, one of the things is a little bit out of scope for this discussion, but I will say, reliance on utility meter data, is potentially a challenge, but one thing we would like to see, rather than bypass that process, is enhance the ability for entities to get, utility meter data and speed that process up and work on, the data flow there, which I really recognize CAISO can't necessarily solve, but it's a barrier that maybe just the device level registration doesn't solve for all entities.
Thanks, Sabrina. Yeah, I do realize we are out of time. So maybe you could just stop here. And if any more comments, we do encourage folks to comment on the discussion paper, and we'll have a follow-up after this meeting on that. But so thanks again to Ben and Perry for that, and Sabrina. Yeah, it sounds like that's where we're at now, is what really constitutes an enhancement before it's considered new, right? And whether that's actually needed to the current suite of baselines, and to be very methodical and thoughtful for how we even approach any new baselines. So this is all great for us to take back. And I think we've got enough from comments in today's discussion to really think about these problem statements and to come back next time with a very sort of crystallized view on what we think would be the next step moving forward to carry this into proposal development, or any other thoughts and how to further consolidate the problem statements here. So with that, any final comments, thoughts from anybody before I will kindly hand it over to Yelena to conclude?
Yeah, let's go to Perry.
Yeah, go ahead, Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Cisa. Sorry about that. I got knocked off of or onto mute before I had a chance to finish my thought. I think I just wanted to highlight that a good approach at this point would be to do what you're doing, which is identify if there are issues with the current PEMs, and to the extent that there are issues that are preventing participation, our time is better spent digging into the issues that are preventing the participation, rather than just concluding up front that we do not need additional PEMs.
Thanks, Perry. Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to sort of align on. And it sounded like, Ben's thoughts were in line with that, just wanting to make sure that, once we do, or if we do ever explore additional baselines, just be extremely thoughtful. And definitely we'll be having to have more discussion on how to weigh all of that if it actually gets to that point.
All right, thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Barry. Good to hear
Just a
from you
couple
again.
comments in the chat that say Sabrina and Luke. Sabrina that was speaking earlier, and Luke, yes, both agree with Perry.
Okay, thanks, Yelena. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, I'll turn it back to you, Yelena. Thank you.
All right, let's go to the next slide. So we don't have a formal comment period for this or a comment template, but if you would like to look at this presentation, you have the link there to the webpage on our Stakeholder Center, and you can send any questions to ISO Stakeholder Affairs or me, and I will get those routed and get answers and involvement there. Let's go to the next page. We've recently started including these. I don't think you can click on them from here, but if you go and you open up the page, I think the PDF will still let you follow these links if you needed. So we have all of the stakeholder meetings and links in one place, and the next page. We've got the deadlines listed here. We've got trainings, market sim release schedule link, and BPM process listed in here. And next slide, if you want to stay involved in the Energy Matters blog, you can subscribe to receive this with the link here. So thank you so much for the great discussion and involvement and engagement today, and we look forward to working with you further. Have a good day.
This event has concluded. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.